that if a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, the man that lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall put away evil from Israel. So here's what they were doing. They were trying to deal with Jesus' credibility. Was Jesus going to say something contrary to what it said in the Mosaic Law? You see that the law that was given by Moses is referred to as the Mosaic Law. Is he going to go along with it? Well, if Jesus goes along with it, we're going to have a good stoning on our hands, just like they did with Stephen in the book of Acts. We're going to see it take place right in front of us. But here, Jesus' reputation is definitely different. Remember, Jesus, his reputation, he's not trying to place judgment on anyone because he's the Messiah. He's come to have the judgment laid upon him for the sins of the world. Understand what Jesus has been teaching. Let me give you some verses. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Jesus said, "Judge not that ye be not judged." And then also in Luke chapter 6, verse 37, Jesus said, "Judge not, and ye shall not be judged. Condemn not, and ye shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven." So Jesus' philosophy and his whole view is totally different. Now, did Jesus come to destroy the law? Absolutely not. Jesus came to fulfill the law. Well, you might be asking yourself, well, if the law says that this woman and this man, these individuals should be stoned to death, then why wouldn't Jesus just say, okay, well, just have at it, take them out and stone them? Because the judgment was not to fall upon them. Judgment was to fall upon him on the cross. Forgiveness was being made available. But here Jesus had to handle this situation and such. Can you imagine? Here when we look at this, we say, wow, he's in the middle. Is he going to go with the law, or is he going to go with what he's teaching? We should love one another and forgive one another. So it's interesting to see exactly what takes place. And we see that in verse 7. Now, keep in mind, Jesus just keeps going on teaching just like he didn't hear them. And then verse 7, we see, "But as they continued to ask him," this is the scribes and the Pharisees, "he lifted himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her." Interesting what Jesus says. Well, let me give you a couple other Old Testament verses. What Jesus is talking about, that the scribes and Pharisees understood perfectly clear. That is, first, in Deuteronomy 13:9. It tells us, "But you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people." Now I want you to understand the context. We're going to look at another verse. Chapter 17 and verse 7 of Deuteronomy. That's what it says. It gives a little bit more clarity. Looking at the context. "The hands of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. So you shall put away the evil from among you." Now here's the key. The witnesses that observe are the ones to be the executioners. In other words, you witness something yourself, and you see it done, and you see it's a violation of the law. There's one key the Scripture says in that verse, in the context of verse 9, and that is the fact of verse 13 of Deuteronomy, verse 9, and that is the fact if you have not committed the same sin. Do you understand the context? You witness something, but if you've done the same thing, then you can't place judgment. So Jesus is standing up and he's saying, okay, all of you who have not committed this sin that you are making an accusation to, you're the witnesses, you're the ones that bring these accusations, you're the first ones to cast the first stone. Now, think about the consequences of that. What does the Scriptures teach us? What did Jesus teach? What did Paul in his writings in the New Testament teach us? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's none righteous. No, not one. You know, one of the things that I've learned, it is so easy to point your finger at somebody. But, you know, I had, just as a little child, somebody said, boy, you better be careful pointing fingers. Because when you point a finger at somebody to make an accusation, remember, you got three pointing back at you. And I often thought about that. We don't like to judge ourselves, do we? We don't like to, look and criticize ourselves. We always push blame, somewhere else. Well, here, this is exactly what Jesus was doing, with these scribes and Pharisees. So here, look in verse 8 of John chapter 8. We see what took place next. We see that, and again bending down, he wrote on the ground. Jesus did. So Jesus, he's told them. They understand perfectly. So what is Jesus doing now? Well, theologians have had the biggest field day on earth about this verse right here. They said, Jesus used it like a white marker board, and he started writing down the names of the women that, probably the scribes and Pharisees have had relations with. Probably all different, things that wrote down. Here's what I do know. That here it convicted the hearts of everyone there. Jesus used that sand to become a mirror. So these individuals saw their own lives. Look what it says here in the text. It tells us next in verse 9. And hearing and being convicted by conscience, they went out one by one, beginning at the oldest until the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in their midst. So here, Jesus, not saying a word, writing, scrolling, whatever he was on the ground, we see that everybody there became convicted by God himself, and they began to see their own sin. Now, what's interesting is, usually who has the hardest hearts? Well, it's older. They say, the older you get, the harder your heart is, and, we're probably less flexible when it comes to God's leading. But we see here that Jesus, whatever he did, it convicted the hearts of the oldest. So that would have been the closest ones to Jesus. And what they began to do? Began to leave. Down to the last person. Even the youngest person that was there, they left. And then here Jesus, he's just standing there. And here the woman in his midst. And then verse 10 we see, and bending back up from the ground, and seeing no one but the woman, Jesus said to her, Woman, where are the ones who accuse you? Do not one give judgment against you? So here he's saying to her, now, where are these people? These people, these witnesses that caught you in the act, where are they to accuse you right this moment? In verse 11, she responds, and she says, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I give judgment. Go and sin no more. Now what's interesting, at that last part of that verse, it says in the original Greek language, it says, Jesus is saying, leave your life of sin. Now remember what Jesus did. Remember when he healed the man by the pool of Bethesda? Then he told him, he goes, when he sees him again, he said, go and sin no more. Physical healing, we see that, here, Jesus is forgiving sin. He's telling him, go and sin no more. Change your life. Change how you leave this life of sin. Now, can you imagine how she's standing there, and here, this was a saving for her. Do you think that she thought she was getting ready to get stoned? Oh, yes. Listen, it'd been one thing if it had just been somebody bringing some witnesses coming, here to bring accusations against her from the community. But when the scribes and Pharisees drugged this woman, these religious rulers, they were going to see blood. And let me tell you something. They draw blood. The Jews, historically, they love following the letter of the law in the Old Testament. And here Jesus was coming to fulfill the law. Why did Jesus, in this passage, he says, well, there's no one here to place judgment on you. I will not place judgment on you either. That's what he's saying here in this passage. How can Jesus do that? How does Jesus have that authority? Well, you have to keep it in context with what Jesus has been teaching. When we look at the Old Testament and we see God set very high standards, just like we see right here, if you catch a man and a woman in adultery, yes, they are to be stoned to death. But keep it in context. If you've committed sin also,